Perhaps it was deemed necessary even at this late stage due to plunging morale and the proliferation of drugs among the ranks. On the 27th of September, when Seabees had completed its construction, Navy chaplains conducted the first Catholic Mass and Protestant service.
You're soldiers of God, you must understand. The fate of your country is in your young hands. May God give you strength, do your job real well. If it all was worth it, only time it will tell. In the morning they return with tears in their eyes. The stench of death drifts up to the skies. A young soldier so ill looks at the sky pilot, remembers the words, thou shalt not kill.
By November, nearly 11,000 soldiers had been arrested on drug charges, making it clear that the Army's marijuana eradication program of 1969 had not been the success it had claimed. Adding support to that conclusion was the November 13th U.S. evening news broadcast showing a Vietnam soldier demonstrating how they smoked marijuana from the barrel of a gun. Though soldiers laughed at this novel method of getting blown away, parents and congressmen in the U.S. were not amused. Worse yet, the marijuana suppression campaign had driven ever more soldiers to smoking heroin, which was odorless and easier to conceal. A tobacco cigarette would be rolled between the finger and thumb to loosen the tobacco, and the cigarette would be partially emptied. A $5 plastic vial containing 250 milligrams of 95% pure heroin would then be poured into the cigarette and smoked. Thousands of soldiers were now returning home addicted to heroin, uncounted among those wounded in action, but in just as much pain. On the 10th of November, Major John W. Gordy, Jr. succeeded Major Jack L. Leopard as company commander. His executive officer, Captain William Dew, was given the task of leading the Crazy Cats part in the NAF's Weed and Seed program, an effort to control the troublesome sand by growing plants. Necessary, perhaps, but unpopular among the enlisted men who had to do the work. Expressing their displeasure with humor, the men dedicated a park in Captain Dew's name. With America firmly committed to withdraw from Vietnam, the war had been neutralized as a domestic political issue. By the autumn of 1970, American MIAs and POWs had become the central issue in America and a main negotiating point at the Paris peace talks. From that point on, the American POWs would become Hanoi's chief bargaining chip in negotiations. Some would claim the term hostages would be a more accurate portrayal of the truth. Rivalry between the Army and Navy was a long-standing tradition, but seldom in their history had they been stationed together as closely or as long as those at NAF. The exchange of friendly barbs and challenges was common, and each was forever trying to get the other's goat. Literally. Rivalry always reached its peak in the autumn, climaxing with the traditional Army-Navy football game, which was broadcast live over Armed Forces radio or TV around the world. On the night of 27 November 1970, the eve of the Army-Navy game, a group of crazy cats stole into the pen where the Navy kept its mascot, a goat. They had come armed with a can of spray paint and stencils from the airframe shop, and, while someone held the goat still, others applied the stencils and sprayed "Beat Navy" on one side of the goat. By coincidence, the Navy had also been promoting a Name the Goat contest, so the men submitted their suggestion spraying "Crazy Cat" on the other side. The Navy never said if the Army suggestion had won, but they did get a measure of revenge for the paint job. In a hard-fought battle, the Navy football team beat the Army that year, 11-7. The Navy wasn't always so lucky playing sports against the Crazy Cats, though. 1970 had seen the revival of an inter-service sports league at NAF with competitions in football, softball, basketball, and volleyball. As many as 12 teams competed in the league, with only one or two Crazy Cat teams among them. Despite the odds against them, the Crazy Cats were consistently at the top of their league. Although the Crazy Cats lost the 1970 football championships to the Navy in overtime, they did win two other championships that year, softball and volleyball. 5 years of war in Vietnam had taken its toll on the U.S. Army, not only in terms of dead and wounded, but in terms of re-enlistment. Disillusioned, unappreciated, and underpaid, fewer soldiers were willing to stay once their agreed term of enlistment was done. To encourage the soldiers to re-enlist or re-up, the Army put up posters and billboards like this one being painted on one of the Crazy Cats' office walls. More effective than crude advertising, however, were the bonuses they offered, some as high as $10,000. One of the Crazy Cats to take advantage of the program was Staff Sergeant James Miner, who took his re-enlistment oath from Company Commander Major John W. Gordy aboard a Neptune on the 29th of November. Christmas once again brought Bob Hope to Vietnam and Cam Ranh Bay, this his 7th consecutive USO Christmas tour. Topping the bill with him were actress Ursula Andress, singer Lola Falana, and baseball player Johnny Bench. The Gold Diggers were back again for their 3rd straight year, as well as the perennial Les Brown and his band of renown. Bob's jokes this year included references to marijuana, bringing loud laughs from the crowd when he joked with feigned naivete, "I hear you guys are interested in gardening here. Our security officer said a lot of you guys are growing your own grass." When Bob left Vietnam a few days later, 330,800 American troops remained behind, nearly 140,000 fewer than the previous year. January 1971 began with another session of the Paris peace talks, and, like the 97 previous sessions, no progress was made. South Vietnamese troops from last April's Operation Total Victory were still in Cambodia and, with American air support, were trying to save the capital city of Phnom Penh from falling to the NVA. The first major test of the Vietnamization program began in early February with an operation called Lam Son 719. The operation had an ambitious objective: to cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail by taking Chepon, a much-bombed Laotian town and major logistics center along the trail. To accomplish this task, 20,000 Vietnamese soldiers had amassed at the Khe Sanh area to launch their assault with the support of American helicopters and airplanes. Prior to the attack, the situation on the ground in Laos appeared quiet, but the NVA were playing possum. Knowing well in advance that the attack was coming, they'd set a trap. When Lam Son 719 began on the 8th of February, the South Vietnamese met little resistance at first, but once they'd fallen into the trap, they and their American support aircraft came under withering NVA fire.
Taking fire! Taking fire! Roger, we have guns on the way. And Chalk 6 is taking fire. Got 2 ships down, one just crashed and burned. Jesus Christ, that thing went up. They've got 23mm all the way down this flight path. You've got to remain south of the river and grab some altitude coming in here. Coming out of the LZ at this time. My ship's running a little rough. We took a lot of fire. I don't know if I heavy hits or not. I believe I got an overflight. I got a gunner hit in the head, some of the troops hit, and the aircraft's hit pretty hard, and I was losing fuel, but it stopped losing the fuel now, so I'm just heading back into Kilo Zero. Get out of that LZ! Get out of that LZ!
The South Vietnamese were badly beaten from the start and were kept on the defensive throughout the 46-day operation. Some were so desperate to escape the slaughter, they clung to the skids of departing American medevac helicopters. When the last of them were withdrawn on the 25th of March, they had suffered 3,000 dead and 7,000 wounded. Without massive American air support, their casualties would have been even worse. A war zone may seem an unlikely place to find love, but it was found 1,000 times over in Vietnam. One of those times it was found at the NAF, when Crazy Cat Specialist 5 Stephen McCoy met Dao Fung Mai, an NAF employee. Stephen proved the adage, love conquers all, when he managed to find his way through the Army, Embassy, and Vietnamese red tape to marry his bride in a ceremony held at the NAF chapel on the 24th of March. On the 8th of March, Major Antonio V. Gonzalez became the new company commander. The American troop withdrawal brought a reduction of the number of support units, including those of the 509th Group, and in March 1971, the 144th Aviation Company in Nha Trang was deactivated. Along with some of their RU-8D aircraft, 19 of its pilots and 50 of its enlisted men were reassigned to the 1st Radio Research Company, becoming official members of the Crazy Cat family. The reassignment, coincidentally, brought the reunion of two brothers, Rod Hewitt, a Neptune pilot, and Al, an RU-8D pilot of the 144th. On the night of May the 23rd, sappers and rockets struck Cam Ranh again.
U.S. aircraft, some using fuel from two nearby bases, continue to fly out of Cam Ranh Bay today, despite an overnight raid by guerrillas which resulted in the destruction of almost 2 million gallons of aviation fuel. The Viet Cong stole into Cam Ranh under cover of darkness and blew up the fuel tanks, setting off the raging fires. While Americans had their hands full battling the blaze, communists poured mortar fire into the big base, once thought the most secure in South Vietnam. Despite the fires and attack, though, there were no casualties.
More than a few minutes, NAF missed a heartbeat or two when one of the rockets in the attack landed at the NAF, hitting the officers' Sandman Club. The 1st of July was a sad day for the Crazy Cats. It was sadder still for the lady they had called Mama, the girls who worked for her, and the people of Cavite City. After 73 years as a U.S. naval station, Sangley Point was inactivated. 3 months later, it was officially turned over to the Philippine government. The Crazy Cats, however, continued their corrosion control flights to the Philippines, flying instead to the naval station at Kubi Point. On the afternoon of August the 25th, Cam Ranh was shaken by an enormous explosion as hundreds of tons of ammunition blew up.
Just as the Allies had feared, the Communists are stepping up their attacks to take advantage of the political confusion in Saigon. 5 American bases were shelled, including the big U.S. air base at Da Nang. And at Cam Ranh Bay, enemy sappers crawled through the wire and set off a mammoth explosion in an ammunition dump. Hundreds of tons of bombs and other explosives were destroyed. This is the second time this year that Cam Ranh Bay has been hit. ABC's Irv Chapman reports on the security problems at the base.
This burned-out oil storage tank is a monument to the talent of the Viet Cong infiltrator. It is smack in the middle of Cam Ranh's 25,000 acres. Yet one night in May, a small group of sappers reached it. They placed explosive delayed charges and escaped. 1 3/4 million gallons of petroleum went up in smoke. Yet Cam Ranh Bay is probably the most secure of all American bases here in Vietnam. It is located on a peninsula surrounded on 3 sides by water. American infantrymen patrol its outer reaches, and placing sensing devices that are still top secret. We were not permitted to film them or accompany a patrol to where they really are. The Navy uses dogs to guard its small compound and the adjoining stretch of beach. The hills and valleys of the mainland are VC territory. The Mekar Bridge is the only road link from the base. It's patrolled all night starting at 6 p.m. by men of the 51st Infantry. Now more than ever, the Viet Cong operate by night. As darkness replaces twilight, the guards change off every hour and a half. This might seem like tedious duty, but most of these men spent the early part of their Vietnam tour fighting Viet Cong in the jungle, so guarding a bridge isn't so bad. All over South Vietnam tonight, American soldiers are still on guard duty, still on patrol. The Viet Cong is still around, too. This is Irv Chapman, ABC News, on the bridge over the Cam Ranh Bay, South Vietnam.
In response to the growing heroin epidemic, MACV had begun offering amnesty to users instead of punishment. To help men overcome their addiction, they opened detoxification centers staffed by psychologists and assisted by former addicts themselves. At airports and post offices, stricter customs inspections were made before men or mail were sent home. At Cameron that October, they took extreme measures to do so.
China has its Great Wall, and Berlin has its wall, which a lot of people think isn't so great. Now, courtesy of Uncle Sam, the tiny village of Cam Ranh in South Vietnam is getting a wall of its own. Bob Simon tells why.
The little village sits on one end of the peninsula. It's the only Vietnamese village here. The rest of the land belongs to the massive American installation called Cam Ranh Bay. 3 years ago, because of prostitution and drugs, the village was declared off-limits to Americans. A barbed wire fence was put up around the village, and military police patrolled the border night and day. But the fence wasn't much of a barrier. A few weeks ago, the deputy commander at Cam Ranh, Colonel John Enzer, decided to do something about it. He decided to build a wall. The wall, the first of its kind in Vietnam, is being built with pierced steel plankings that's 9 feet high. When it's finished in about a month, it will be almost a mile long. It will form a semicircle around the village. The only way the Vietnamese will be able to come and go will be by water, 3 miles to the mainland. Hey, what are you doing?
Pardon me?
What are you doing?
Welding these pickets on the side to prevent, well, mostly it's for looks. Looks and for cracks. You know, they pass anything through it.
Yeah.
And for cracks and for looking through and stuff. And it helps the structure of the fence.
Think it's going to work?
I don't know. They can dig underneath it pretty well, even though with the cement and everything.
Do you think it's going to work, Colonel?
Well, we're very hopeful, of course, and I think that you've already seen one example of the ingenuity that we're going to be confronted with in the tunnel that has already been dug through the sand underneath the 3-foot footing. We feel that in combination with the metal fence and the improved effectiveness of our guards, that we will succeed in reducing it considerably.
What do you think about the wall? Well, I don't have any more objections to the wall than the concertina wire fence that was here before. But what I can't see is why these people have to be fenced in when it's their own nation.
Many of the village's 4,000 inhabitants have legitimate reasons to be on the base. They work there. Every day, hundreds of maids, cooks, and waitresses show their ID cards and are searched for contraband at the American checkpoint. Even the prostitutes have a legal way to get on base. GIs pick them up and sign them out. All the wall can conceivably accomplish is to keep the Americans out of the village and perhaps slow down the drug flow. One officer said, "We came here to save the Vietnamese from the communists. Now we're trying to save the Americans from the Vietnamese." Bob Simon, CBS News, Cam Ranh Bay.
Like elsewhere in Vietnam, Caucasian or round-eye women were a very rare sight at Cam Ranh. So it is no surprise that with 20,000 men on the base, the 100 or so donut dollies and nurses there were in very high demand. Very much aware of that demand, military clubs sought musical groups with women, particularly Caucasian women, to perform at their clubs. One night, just such a band came to perform at Cam Ranh's Air Force Officers Club. Like most Caucasian bands touring Vietnam, it was Australian. A group of Crazy Cat pilots was also in attendance at the club that night, and turning on their famed Crazy Cat charm, enticed a young lady from the band to visit their Sandman Club at the NAF.
There ain't a thing that's wrong with any man here that can't be cured by putting him near a girly, womanly, female, feminine.
In early December, MACV implemented a urinalysis check for all soldiers leaving Vietnam. Able to detect heroin usage in the past 10 days, those who did not pass the test were sent to detoxification centers for treatment before being allowed to go home. At many bases, Troops now smoked marijuana openly during their off-duty hours. Commanders and NCOs would sometimes pass by and visit and have a friendly chat with them as they smoked, perhaps thinking to themselves, "Thank God it's not heroin." This year's Bob Hope Christmas show starred country singer Charlie Pride, actor-singer Jim Nabors, and actress Jill St. John. It would be his last performance at Cameron Bay. By Christmas next year, not a single American would remain there. On the 28th of December, Major Joshua Kaiser became the 9th and last commander of the Crazy Cats. By the end of 1971, only 151,000 American troops remained in Vietnam, 180,000 less than last year. For the Crazy Cats, the war would come to an early end. Rapidly advancing technology had allowed the development of signal interception systems that were able to perform the same mission using smaller aircraft and fewer crew. 3 of these new aircraft, the Ju-21A Left Jab, had arrived in early 1971 and were assigned to the 138th Aviation Company at Phu Bai. Though technically more advanced than the Crazy Cat system, they lacked the Crazy Cat's luck. Misfortune quickly found them, and on the 4th of March 1971, one was shot down by a surface-to-air missile over the DMZ with the loss of all 5 crew members. Their remains would never be found or recovered.
Floating down through the clouds, memories come rushing up to meet me now. But in the space between the heavens and the corner of some foreign field, I had a dream. Goodbye, Max. Goodbye, Ma. After the service, when you're walking slowly to the car, and the silver in her hair shines in the cold November air, you hear the tolling bell and touch the silk in your lapel. As the teardrops rise to meet the comfort of the band, you take her frail hand and hold on to the dream.
By January 1972, everyone at Cameron, including the Crazy Cats, knew they would soon be leaving and were making preparations. In the meantime, some would have a last fling.
With the South Vietnamese assuming more of the combat burden, American servicemen often find themselves with leisure time on their hands. To help fight boredom, American officials have opened the gates at more than one base to some practitioners of the world's oldest profession. Bob Simon reports.
The GIs at Cameron Bay call it the meat market. It's open 7 days a week from 9 in the morning till 11 at night. The girls for sale all live in a village behind that wall. The wall was built a few months ago to keep the GIs out of the village and to keep most of the villagers off the base. but there's still a perfectly legal way for the Americans to pick up Vietnamese girls. This is how it works. A GI gets a letter of authorization from his commanding officer. He picks his mate, who is then searched for drugs and contraband. The GI and the girl then surrender their ID cards to the MPs, and the girl is given a pass to wear on base until she returns to the village. On the average day, 300 girls are checked out in this way. On payday, it can go up to 500. Are you waiting for someone in particular?
Yes. Just one of the girls.
How long have you known her?
About 5 minutes.
Why'd you come down today?
Something to do.
The commanding officers realize there's a serious VD problem at Cam Ranh, and that the guest system, as it's called, probably contributes to it. But they argue that no one has ever been able to prevent boys and girls from getting together, and that by doing things this way, they retain a certain measure of control. The MPs, for example, know exactly which girls are on base at which time with which escorts. They also know approximately where they are because they're only allowed at the beach, the clubs, the mess halls, and the snack bar. The girls are strictly forbidden from entering the barracks, and they must be back at the checkpoint by curfew at 11 p.m. The command, of course, is sensitive to security. Many GIs are more sensitive to the kind of human relations the system imposes upon them and the way it degrades the girls, many of whom they consider not prostitutes, but friends.
It's nice to have a female to talk to. You get tired of talking to a GI all the time.
But you don't pay your girlfriend any money?
No comment on that. I don't pay them directly, you know. I take them out, buy them food, or buy them an umbrella or a purse or something. But as far as the direct money exchange goes, I can't see that, you know. Some GIs do it, and it's a girl's living. I mean, this is their living right here, being a boyfriend to a GI.
The ranking officers at Cam Ranh don't view the meat market as a particularly wholesome affair, but they say, consider the alternatives. Let the GIs into the village and forfeit all control over security and drugs. Discontinue the so-called guest system altogether and make morale worse than it already is. Of course, the VD problem could be controlled by giving the girls regular medical checkups, but that would put the Army in the position of supervising prostitution, and American public opinion might not be quite ready for that. Bob Simon, CBS News, Cam Ranh Bay.
In mid-January, the Paris peace talks resumed after a month of postponements, but the North Vietnamese continued to play their POW card, demanding a total withdrawal and an end of all support for the South Vietnamese government in exchange for releasing the American POWs. In February, the talks would break down completely when the Communists walked out. Though there was no progress in the peace talks, a breakthrough in American relations with Communist China was in the offing. On the 21st of February, President Nixon made his historic visit to China, where he held talks with Chinese leaders Chairman Mao Zedong and Premier Chou En-lai. Most significantly, Nixon left with a Chinese promise not to interfere in the affairs of other countries, allaying fears that Asia would be engulfed in more communist wars of liberation. China had been the main protagonist in such wars in Southeast Asia, and with their promise, the war in Vietnam took less importance for America. Vietnam, along with Cambodia and Laos, could now be sacrificed if necessary. The red tide would flow no further. By mid-March, the American withdrawal from Cam Ranh was nearing completion.
In Saigon, the U.S. command listed 2 Americans killed and 19 wounded in its latest weekly combat report. The casualty toll was the lowest in 3 months. Lower casualty figures reflect the continuing pullout of U.S. troops from Vietnam. Yesterday, it was announced that another 5,700 Americans have been ordered home. ABC's Jim Giggins filed this report on one former base in Vietnam that U.S. troops are now dismantling.
The Americans are leaving Cam Ranh Bay, and the quiet that now engulfs this once bustling installation is almost eerie. The corridors of Cam Ranh's hospital are now empty, with the cries of the wounded stilled and the screech of ambulances silent. It's the same inactivity in the barracks. Usually, the only person about is a cleaning lady, collecting the dirt and dust from a nearly abandoned building. What activity there is left at Cam Ranh is involved with getting Americans and their equipment out. There's no building going on, only tearing down. Storage yards are filled with everything from refrigerators, desks, and mattresses to generators, air conditioners, and toilets. More than 60,000 pieces of equipment must be moved by May. Much of this has been sold to the South Vietnamese Army, which will take over this base in June. Some will be sold as junk. But usable items, such as prefabricated buildings and trailers, and this aluminum matting used for portable runways, will be shipped to other bases in the Pacific or back to the United States. For many Americans, the phase down of Cam Ranh is rather like a tragic completed cycle. Along with places like Khe Sanh, Pleiku, and Chu Lai, this base was intimately associated with the American agony in Vietnam. But to the Americans here now, this war is all but over. And soon, much of Cam Ranh will be reclaimed by the sand and the brush, the sea and the wind. Jim Giggins, ABC News at Cam Ranh Bay, South Vietnam.
2 weeks later, on the 31st of March, the Crazy Cats boarded number 429 and took off on their last mission. There was no grand celebration upon their return early that evening, only some small or private ones. There was still another month of packing and shipping before the Crazy Cats would finally reach the end. Rumors of a major communist offensive had been floating around Vietnam since Tet. It finally came on Easter weekend, the 31st of March. In the so-called Easter Offensive, the NVA attacked An Lac, northwest of Saigon, and Quang Tri, just south of the DMZ. They also steamrolled over Kon Tum in the Central Highlands and were heading for the coast, threatening to cut the country in two. An Lac held, but Quang Tri fell as NVA tanks rumbled across the DMZ and attacked the city. American B-52s and other aircraft were shifted from missions in Laos and Cambodia to concentrate at An Lac, Kon Tum, and Quang Tri. In April, President Nixon ordered a resumption of bombing over North Vietnam and ordered the mining of its port, adding ever more pressure on the North Vietnamese to halt the Easter Offensive and negotiate a settlement at the Paris peace talks. It was amid the Easter Offensive, the 30th of April, that the first radio research company would finally stand down. Also attending the stand down was Cam Ranh's base commander, Air Force Colonel Kaiser, who was, coincidentally, the brother of Crazy Cat's commander, Major Joshua Kaiser. The men, standing in formation on the tarmac, were called to attention.
Through these fields of destruction, baptisms of fire, I've witnessed your suffering.
Soldiers who were to be awarded medals were called to the front. The 224th Aviation Battalion commander was also on hand to pin medals on each one.
In the fear and